Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. I'm going to be sharing with you a little bit of my comic process, pretty much just my inking approach and how I am currently working on this style comic here. It's a short story. It's set in the Starvale universe, the Starvale being the comic series I started a long time ago. And I just wanted to share a little bit about kind of how I'm going about this, what brush I'm using, how things go step by step, and just kind of my thinking for each part of that. So anyway, let's get into it, and I will show you what I've done so far today. Okay, so right now I have my one of my main characters here. I have a character that's going right next to them, just a headshot type deal. It's a close-up of them for the first time kind of talking in this issue. And I have my reference pulled up here. I'll pull it up on the screen so you can see, which is just the last page of the comic that I posted up. And I just will be looking at that for some color ref and style reference. So what I do for my comics is I'll have, let's see, I'll have a page layout that I did. This one just happened to be done in Clip Studio, where I drew it out with some of the brushes that you may have downloaded. I think this one's the pencil brush. And I do this full, here, I'll shut off my main character there. I do this full kind of breakdown of the thumbnail, what the comic's gonna look like. I like doing some kind of ornate looking framed panels for the layout for this comic in particular. And I would like to do that in general with all comics, but you know, some of them don't really allow for that with the size of the comic and the time that it would take. So this one being a short story, I can get a little bit crazier, I guess, with the panel layouts. So a lot of them are throughout this whole process are going to be more complicated. Like if you can see that I have like cutout circles on all the corners, and some of them are kind of shaped like this and curved edges, and some of the pages are pretty crazy in terms of like having big like swooping waves cut through them and all that. But yeah, I generally will do something like this just to lay out the overall look of the page. I turn the opacity way down. I think it was at like 8% opacity on that layer. And then I'll do a sketch over top the thumbnail drawing, which is this one here. So I use the kind of blocky, sharp detail brush that I have shared with you all. You can see it here. It's the one called Sharp Details. And using that at about 80% opacity, I will just kind of draw in a rough idea of what I think the character looks like. I'll draw in the side character here just a little bit to give you an idea. I'm not really worried about my like inking style coming across when I do this. It's more just to refine and have a basic idea of where the character is kind of sitting on the page, with some roughed in anatomy that's feeling a bit more finished than the previous thumbnail. The thumbnails that I do are mainly just to get across the composition of the piece, but I do have the best intentions doing those thumbnails of making things look right. But, you know, with the first kind of go through, I feel like that's rarely the case for me. So anyway, here you go. This is a rough idea of what the character will look like in placement on the page. And then once I have all of this on the panel here, I can take this background, you know, once the character's finished. So I mean, like, let's just basically rough in the finish for this guy. You know, he's gonna have these beads on his necklace. He's gonna have some long wispy hairs blowing in the wind. And I know he has his shoulder pads, whatever. And then that's it. So I take that, and then I will, you can do this if you want, you don't have to, but I will flip horizontally in the view, flip horizontal, and I will clean up the character a bit. So a couple ways to do this. If you're feeling that the thumbnail to revised sketch isn't clean enough for your final inks, you can do another pass over the character, lower the opacity down, do one more refinement. It depends, how much you want to go into detail at this stage. I feel fairly confident with how these characters are going to look that I don't think I need to do that. So I generally don't, but I can go into my finished kind of sketch of that character, which is this guy here. So this is what I had laid in previously for when I did my final inks. I don't follow this one for one. Again, it's just like a refinement of what I had already. So then I will just basically lower the opacity down on this, flip it back, because the main thing I'm trying to do is kind of see it from a new angle when I flip it so that I have an idea of what I'm correcting as I go. It's just essentially getting a new look on a piece so that you kind of know what you're doing. And then I'll make a new layer. I'll choose my inking brush, and then I can select black inks or colored inks. It doesn't really matter. I usually colorize my inks when I'm done kind of laying out a page. Like if you look at that previous page that I did here, this one has not purely black inks. It has some like colored inks in there. It's like a dark, deep red color. So I'll do that for most of my comic stuff, because I don't, like, black inks works for the certain styles that you're going for, but for me, generally speaking, I don't use black inks for my page, I was going to say my pages, but pretty much like any of my paintings or drawings or anything that starts with like an inking phase, I do not do black inks for the most part. Even the ones that look black, like I posted up that Guts piece from Berserk, that's not purely black either. And I like to colorize the lines because I can give a bit more atmosphere to the piece. And I also like the faded look of that colorized line because it gives a feeling of an older piece. Like with this comic in particular, I'm thinking that this is a comic that you'll feel you've discovered in an old bin at a comic shop. Like it's an older comic printed on kind of yellowed paper, and it has a nice texture to it. So that's what I'm trying to do. So within the actual inked layer, and I'll show you this process in just a second, I will actually use a textured brush and kind of paint in different colors so that it gives this kind of granular look to it. It's very grainy, has some nice like texture to it. So even in the shadow dark line layer, there's actual texture there that's not just one solid flat vectorized color, which is what I'm trying to avoid. I want it to look as like organic as possible. Okay, so now we have our inking brush selected. I'll show you what this process looks like. So you can zoom in as far as you want, do whatever. I'm using a TorBox controller right now. I can pull that over and show you. You can see that. I don't know if the light's showing it. So this is a controller I use for my process. It has a wheel on it that zooms in and out, but it doesn't like zoom in perfectly. So it has these weird in-betweens where some of the zooms are a little blurry, so the line doesn't look super crisp. So sometimes I have to actually touch the keyboard for a second, and then there you go. Line looks crisp again. I use kind of varying brush sizes depending on what I'm going for, but we'll see as we go. I also have a wheel on that TorBox where I can kind of turn it either way to increase the brush size up and down so that I don't have to tap the keys over and over again on the keyboard. I really like having a controller like that because I find that it's just it goes into my process a bit more naturally. They actually reached out to me after I bought one and were like, would you be willing to do a review of future stuff? And I was like, sure, whatever. It was just weird because they offered me a free one, and I was like, I actually just bought this for like $100 bucks or whatever it was. I bought it specifically because, and you might have this problem, the keyboard when you're using Photoshop, at least on my other computer previous to this one, I just got the new M1 Mac. My previous computer had the thing where in Photoshop, if I used like any of the Shift Alt whatever keys in order to option to select things, it would stick there so that I couldn't get out of that. When I'd be moving my brush around, it would stay in that weird sticky key thing, which sucked. And the only workaround I found was finding a controller to use, and there's multiple controllers that you can buy, but this is just the one that I kind of settled on because it was cheaper. It wasn't cheap, but it was cheaper than a lot of the things that I saw. So anyway, yeah. So the brush that I have here is a modified Kyle Webster brush. I have a bunch of different versions of this brush. I have versions that are more or less textured, or smaller, bigger texture, and I kind of have different ones depending on the resolution I'm working at. This one that I have here called Inker Boy, that one has kind of a texture that works best at my normal resolution I usually ink at, which is 450 dpi, but you can kind of scale that however you want. I can show you how I do that. Yeah, so in the brushes tab over here, I go over to texture and I can scale it up, which I think is the problem. I can't remember if up-resing this one is by making the texture larger or smaller. Can't honestly remember. I have them all preset, but I adjust it like this on this side. So if you download the brush, you can kind of just play with these settings until something feels right to you at whatever resolution you like to work at. But yeah, I have a bunch of different adjustment ones that I use for different things. So here we go. This is what I kind of do with everything that I'm inking. I just go in and start texturing out. I tried to do a lot of wrapping shapes with my inks. A lot of fine line and things. I like artists like Arthur Rackham, that old inking style. And then I'm also a fan of a lot of detailed manga artists, and yeah, a lot of really nice pen and inks from people like Jerome Opeña, if I'm saying that right. And then a big fan of Pepe Larraz, but he does things more in Clip Studio that aren't super textured, but he has a really great drawing look. So anyway, I'll rough things in like this, texture around, and then just to kind of cut ahead, let's just say, whatever. This is done. Let's move on to what I actually inked. Okay, so this is what I really did for this character. So where do I go from here? How do I move from something that's weirdly detailed into something that's a filled-in character? Because a lot of times with comic stuff that's detailed like this, and the inks are kind of, I don't know what you'd call them, scattered, sketchy, not defined edges, it can be hard to do the fills on something like that. And by fills, I mean, if you're going in and you're coloring your characters, you'd have to go in and do all the individual little details throughout the whole thing, right? So what I do is I make a new layer on top of this, and then I will let's turn on the main character because they're going to sit on top of this character. Okay, so what I usually do is I will kind of figure out what edges do I need to kind of block out for this cat character. And I will, on this new layer, seal off those edges. So I have this chunk here, and then I'm going to make a line across. And I'll make sure that anything else is turned off, like this background. You'll see why in a second, because the main thing I'm doing here is I'm trying to select everything outside of this character. So when I do my inks, I tend to keep everything separate. You don't need to do this, but I find that it makes things way easier. So this character here will sit on its own layer in a group. So this is a group, and you can see in my layers here, made up of a bunch of different things. So there's like the actual inks, and then all the different parts of the character are all colored in on different layers. That's just so I can change the colors if I want to, adjust things. I started doing that. I know it's a little bit crazy. You don't need to do that. But I started doing that specifically because when I went to print on the first humongous book I did, the Steve Lichman book, some of the colors were wrong, and I had to go in and manually change all of them for print. And that was just kind of like the habit I got into, was just like keep everything separate and then double check it with CMYK, make sure it'll print okay, and then go in and then you can flatten it when everything feels good. You don't have to do that. It's just kind of something that stuck with me through that nightmare of a printing process. Okay, so I take the really detailed inked character here, right? I duplicate that layer. And then what I do is I do and I'm going to say this wrong, Gaussian blur, whatever you call it, to that layer. And what that does is it kind of seals all of those little scattery detail holes that are throughout this kind of inked look, because this inked look, I want it to look kind of sketchy and loose, but I don't want to take a million years and fill in everything by hand. So this is my solution to that. The blur will kind of just fill in those gaps. So I hit OK on the blur, and then I go to the magic wand tool, and I make sure that sample all layers is selected at the top. You can't see it here in the video just because I zoomed in a bit so that you could check out my inks a bit easier. But yeah, that's what I have selected at the top. So now I'm going to select outside of the lines here. Make sure that all of the empty space is selected. So everything in between the hairs that I don't want to get filled in. And then I'm going to do an inversion. So I'm going to go to select the top of the screen, inverse, and then I'm going to go to select again, modify, and then contract. And I've been contracting by 2 pixels. I don't think I actually hit it that time. Unless it didn't invert. I don't know what. Oh, okay. That's why. Did it invert? Hold on, let me see. Okay, yeah. All right, select. I was wondering, I was like, what's going on? Sometimes when I'm like at an angle with my stylus, I'm trying to stay close to the mic, but like normally I would move over here and then click it. So because I did it at like an angle with the stylus, it like didn't actually click the button. Okay, so now I can do my fill. So everything is selected where I want it to be selected. I can make a new layer beneath both of the inked layers. I just use my sharp details brush. You don't have to do that. You can just use a paint bucket or whatever you want. I'll select a color that's close to the color of that character, and then I just fill it in. And even with the blur, it doesn't get everything, but it gets pretty close, and then I can just kind of do the fills from there. Just whatever I missed, I can get that. So the reason that I like that modify and contract, which, by the way, was suggested by one of you watching my process, helping me make my life easier, so thank you for that. But yeah, this process is great for just quickly speeding up the boring parts of doing these fills. All right, so I have that all filled in now, and I can take that blurred line layer and I can lower the opacity on that. Sometimes I like to keep that blurred line layer because it adds like a nice bleed to the inks. Because one thing I like about that is that it feels like the inks themselves are bleeding into the paper a bit, which is kind of cool because that gives the effect of some realism. So I'll show you the difference. So this is let's zoom in even more. So this is the clean inks without any kind of blur to them. And then this is the blur, and then we'll lower the opacity on the blur to like 15, 20%. So it's subtle, and I'm kind of a crazy person. So little tiny changes make a huge difference to me. So that is like way different. Like this, the version that doesn't have the blur, sometimes, I mean, you can get away with this. That like this feels fine. I don't think you need to blur this necessarily. For a style, it still works and it feels real. But for what I'm going for like an old print. Like I'm not going for like inked on the page fresh and you're looking at the fresh inked page. I'm looking at I'm thinking of like a reprinted inked page. So like the print process would be the bleed I'm thinking of. So that's why I like adding a little bit of blur, because I find that it also blends a bit nicer with some of the softer textures I use. And then I combine the layers here. Just merge them. I think I've already done a version of that on this. Let me see. Okay, maybe not. Okay, so I merge those, and then I lock the layer so that I can colorize those lines even more. Okay, so let's turn on this layer again. And then just to be completely accurate, I'm going to copy my previous page. Let's make sure we get these colors just right. And I will select my base color layer here. I hit Command on the keyboard, which I forget what that is on PC. Is that Control? And I hold that down, and then I click on the little window on the layer that I want to select. So the base layer is what I'm after, so the base color layer. And that'll only select what the fill, has on it. So now that I have that fill layer selected, oh, by the way, I can shut off that line that I drew in order to make that fill now. So I turn that off if I want. And now I just do Command H or Control H to hide that selection. It's still selected, I just don't see those dotted lines. I go back to my brush and I will just, on a new layer, start painting in each individual color that goes on this character. Now, this is kind of a boring part, but it's really the only tedious thing I do, I think, during my comic processes. Is just these fill parts where you're just kind of brushing in the colors you need for each character. The inking is really where the meat of the work is going in. Otherwise, it's just kind of putting in hours on the tedious stuff, which can be kind of a pain in the ass. And in all reality, if you're about to do a huge comic, and let's say like you're best suited for drawing the whole thing rather than like spending a ton of time coloring, you might as well just kind of like get somebody to help you with that. Not that everybody has help, but if you have a friend, have somebody help you out, so that can save you a ton of time on this sort of thing. I actually have a character concept sheet for this guy. I don't have it pulled up right now, so I'm just going off of the previous page for the colors. But I believe I have different tones. Yeah, I do. For like the mustache and then the eyebrows, parts of the ears. So it's like multiple shades of these colors. I would simplify these characters a little bit more if I were doing like a giant comic with these guys in them. But because I'm doing a short story, I'm not super concerned with that. You know, I won't, this comic right now is about 20 pages, so it's not so crazy to do a pretty long comic with them. I mean, a pretty short comic with them. If I were doing a long comic, it would be a major pain in the ass to do all of these every single time. But yeah, it's not the worst to do it like this. Oh yeah, his lips. He's got a lip color. Oh, one thing I didn't say, which I just did right there, is I have the controller set to use. I have to deselect this for a second just to show you. I have my controller set to use this key on a button. It's the key next to 1. It's right to the left of 1 on the keyboard, that little squiggle line. That little squiggle line, if you hold that down, I mean, you can remap your keyboard to kind of put that key closer to the keys you normally use. At least in Photoshop, you can change, like shortcut keys. But that key is great because if you hold it down, you can use the current brush you're using as an eraser. So that's also what I do on my inks. Like when I'm inking this character, if I do a line that I don't feel like works where I placed it down, I can just quickly tap down that button and just paint it out and it's just gone. But I get to use my brush and I don't have to stop my workflow to get an eraser or anything like that. So that's a really handy thing. And if you do want to speed up what you're doing, I think that's a great way to speed it up, because I don't know, all of those things are really tedious, going in and erasing everything and slowing down your whole process. You might as well just use the brush that you've been using. Okay. So I could do the whole thing right now, but I'm just going to skip ahead to, well, let's do his eyes, just because the eyes are important. All right, let's do the eyes and then jump ahead into just shading this real quick. Okay, so I'm going to select the base layer again so that I don't paint outside of that base layer. And then I'm going to make a multiply layer. And this is kind of a purpley color I'm going for. So a really bright, pale purple tone for my shadows. And then following the lighting that I have set up on the main character here, I'm going to paint in some light on the character using my sharp detail chalky brush, the one that I used to initially sketch out after I did the thumbnails to refine my drawing. I like this just because it's a really simple way to block out lighting, and it doesn't let me get too detailed or too into shading anything. It's nice and simplified for me. So I can quickly just think in terms of shapes when working in the shadows. So yeah, I knocked that in like that. And again, I can paint it out by holding down that squiggle key. Okay, so there we go. All right, so now the next thing I can do is just lock this shadow layer, and I can play with the color a bit, because looking at my main character, it looks like the shadows are a bit more purpley in him. So I'm actually going to go to his set colors, and I'm going to look and see what I used for his shadows, and I'm just going to select that color because I didn't quite get the look I was going for. So let's go over that character again, because we want to make sure they're getting hit by the same temperature, light, and everything. That's better. Okay, so now I feel like my character here on the right, the cat character, I feel like he's a bit too dark. And I know it's not because they're two different colors, but I think because he's supposed to feel like he's sitting behind this character, he's reading like he's coming too forward with those harsh shadows. So because that inked layer is on its own separate thing, I can now lock that layer by clicking on that checkered box here. I have that layer selected, the inking layer. Click this checkered box. You can see that there's a little lock on the layer now. And everything I paint now will only affect the area that's inked. So I selected the color of the inks, and then I just made it a little bit brighter. So I got a little bit more saturation in there. And now I'm just going to brush in some light there. So I'm adding in some red warm light into the shadowed inks here using the General Painter brush, which is a brush I use for pretty much all of my paintings. And another thing you can do is, like, let's say you're set on your shadows, right? Like you like that multiply layer that you had down. I can now select that color that I have for the multiply shadow layer and brush that in a little bit into the inks as well to make a better transition from the fur to the dark shadow. And you can see if that works. I mean, sometimes I do that just to make the lines a little less harsh in certain areas if I feel like it's going too dark in areas that don't make sense to be that dark. Because I don't want to introduce too many new colors, generally speaking. I don't like to do that just to overcomplicate things. But yeah. So next thing I do after all of this is done, let's say the background were totally complete and all my colors were set and I were happy with everything. I would then do my final pass, which is just a white line layer. So I get my sharp details brush. I set the opacity of this brush to about 60%. And then I just choose white for the color for this brush. I do that pretty quick just by hitting D on the keyboard and then X, because it defaults to black and white. X just switches black to white, foreground, background color. And then with a pretty small brush, I just go in and I start painting in highlights on the character. This is a layer that's on top of the other layers. So this is on top of the inks, on top of all my colors and everything. So this will just be little highlighty brush strokes here. and it just gives a little bit more texture to the overall thing, you know? Like, I don't know how you feel about this sort of stuff, but when I was a kid, I really liked looking at comics where it felt like things were touched. Like, each piece of it had, you know, that traditional feel to it. I didn't like the ones that were just simply, you know, colors pasted on top of inks or whatever, like, you know, printed off a little bit off from the actual page. If you've ever seen those, where it's like the printed colors will kind of sit outside the line a little bit with a jitter. I like the ones that just feel like a whole piece, like the Meta Barons comic, for instance. That one that I talked about when I showed some of my books off, where it's like this whole multimedia thing, where there's a bunch of different kind of styles going on at once. So it feels like a little bit of painted, a little bit of inked, and then colored pencil on top and all of that. So I want to get that kind of feel. Like, not one for one trying to copy that, but just that same idea. I want it to come across in this kind of comic. So I don't want it to feel too digital. I want it to feel like I went in there and did little noodly details on everything, because those are the comics that resonated with me when I was young and got me excited to draw. But yeah, that's the last step, and you can see it's a small thing, but I think it adds a lot, and it doesn't take very long. It's just kind of adding in some highlights to round out the forms a bit better. And I don't want to get anything that looks like too great either. Like, I don't care that brush doesn't necessarily feel like a pencil. It doesn't need to. Like, I kind of like that it's just this quick, dumpy looking thing that can go on top of it. I like some of the dirtiness of the overall look of that. But yeah. Anyway, that's my process for this comic. The same thing goes for the backgrounds. The last thing I'll do with all of this is just do adjustments. So if you want to see just a little bit further, I'll select that base layer, and then on top of everything on that character, so just whatever's sitting on top of this base layer up to the highlights, I'll create like a selective color layer, and then I'll do kind of like fine-tune adjustments, you know, this sort of thing, just to play with other kinds of color adjustments and things. You know, you can do a lot with this, and I know that people use curves, and you can use curves if you want. This is just kind of the thing that I'm most used to using, so that's why I kind of lean towards it. But yeah, I'll use this just to do quick adjustments if I don't feel like something's working. And I can just pop them back into the atmosphere a little bit more. But normally you'd want to do those kinds of adjustments once you know the overall look of the whole scene. So I wouldn't necessarily do that at this stage because I don't have everything done on it. And what I mean by that is, like, you'd want the background panel there with the colors all filled in and the background drawn with the lighting, so that I know exactly what adjustments I need to make that character sit perfectly in that background, which I'll probably show you more of in the future, because I'm going to be working on this short story for a little while. I plan on just kind of, you know, inking it out this way, making it really detailed, and hopefully just producing something that looks interesting and go from there. But yeah, I hope that this was helpful. Thanks so much for all your support. I finally have a computer that runs really fast, so I can do these videos again. So thank goodness for that. And I will talk to you all soon. Goodbye.